Hey guys, so before we get into today's video, I just want to say that I don't think you will find a more serious and rigorous scholar of theology in the church than Blake Ostler.
What Joseph Smith is teaching, as I take it, is what Jesus was teaching in John 14 through 17, this kind of mutual glorification.
Blake is the author of the Exploring Mormon Thought book series and podcast with the same name, which you can find on Spotify or iTunes. Blake is fluent or semi-fluent in 9 languages, including Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Egyptian. He will take any reader or listener on a serious, rational exploration of our theology and doctrine. So be sure to check out his book series, Exploring Mormon Thought, and or subscribe to his podcast under the same name. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show. My name is Jacob Hansen, and with me today, I am joined by a very special guest, Blake Ostler. Blake, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for thinking I'm worthy of having on.
Well, I think you definitely are, especially on the topic we're going to be going over today. And the thing I actually wanted to get first is we're going to be delving into biblical scholarship. We're going to be talking about Dan McClellan, who's a biblical scholar. And I want to, first of all, just give a little bit of a background as to your credentials as it relates to biblical scholarship.
My background is actually in philosophical theology, but I wouldn't call myself an expert in Koine Greek, which is the Greek of the New Testament, or in biblical Hebrew. But I'm passable at both. I don't read them like I read newspapers. I keep a dictionary at hand, but I'm pretty good. And I've done a lot of study. Anyone who's read my volumes can see the kind of study that I've done with respect to the biblical works. And my expertise is in a couple of areas. I consider myself to have expertise in the pseudepigrapha, which are a group of writings that range from about 250 BCE to around 150 CE. Works like the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, First Enoch, Second Enoch, even Third Enoch. But R.H. Charles, there have been a number of books that have translated the pseudepigrapha. I consider myself an expert in patristic literature.
And for those who don't know what patristic literature is, what's the layman?
It just means fathers. It means fathers.
The early church fathers.
The early church fathers, beginning with the letters of Clement and Ignatius and going through about the 6th century. Most people would, maybe the patristic fathers are only the first 3 centuries. But
I'm actually, just as a funny side note, I'm actually, as part of my personal study this year for the New Testament, I'm delving into the apostolic fathers myself,
right,
and reading
right.
them. So
I think they're important to know. I also consider myself to have expertise in 17th, 18th, and 19th century Christian thought, specifically having to do from the Reformation on, dealing with the various debates theologically that they had with one another, and specifically the development of the debates among the Calvinists and the Arminians, including Methodists and so forth, in the 19th century. I think I've read most of what's available to read on that. There's a lot. Mm-hmm. And I have taught courses in philosophy, upper division courses, doctoral level courses in philosophy of religion, courses on argumentation and logic and logical fallacies, that kind of a thing. I've taught courses on ethics and meaning, metaphysics, but I was an adjunct teacher because I'm a full-time attorney, and I was named one of the top 100 high-stakes litigators in the United States about 4 years ago. I've done over 100 trials. What I really am is a performer. And so that's kind of my background. And I don't have the chops in biblical Hebrew that Dan has. Dan McClellan, but he's only published one book He has a few articles. He's a newly minted PhD out of Exeter, which is the kind of college where you don't really go on campus. Okay, it's a correspondence kind of a degree, I suppose. But the proof is in the pudding, and Dan is good at explicating the biblical text to novices in a way, what scholarship has found that's fairly arcane and I think generally unknown by most people who read the Bible. And so I think it's at least in some respects a good way to start to get an idea where biblical scholarship has actually been and is going. Anyway, that's my background.
Awesome. And yeah, and I wanted to preface anyone who's watching this with that both you and I were talking beforehand that where I have very serious issues with certain things that Dan says, many things that he says are brilliant and are right on the money and are quite insightful when it comes to, I always say kind of a lot of the times he gets the facts correct, but he gets the interpretation of those facts that come off a little off key. And so I always want to kind of tell people that don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and think just because Dan McClellan or because anyone else says something that, because they say some things that are false, that means that everything they say is false. And I would say the opposite also. Just because people say things that are true doesn't mean that they sometimes will have some bad ideas.
That's in my area, my field of practice, we adopt what we call the rule of charity. We engage an author's strongest arguments, not their weakest arguments. If we can find a saving interpretation that would make their argument stronger than they've made, we're obligated to give it. And we ought to treat, and because, I think we all believe in this, we ought to be charitable with people. I think that we ought to treat people the way we'd like to be treated. And so, the interest is in fairness and giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but being honest with what we're dealing with, maintaining integrity. And so we're going to be talking about a person who ostensibly is a Latter-day Saint. And, I want to treat him with due respect. I also want to preface it with this. We're going to be talking about a subject that I consider to be high TNT for a lot of folks, very close to the heart of some, and difficult for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I have very good friends who both are and who have children who are in same-sex relationships and marriages. I have people in my own family, and I love them. I support them. And the last thing on earth I want to do is to make life more difficult for them. And we're going to be talking about, essentially what Paul and Jesus are saying about same-sex relationships, active homosexual relationships. And I just want to say, and we can get, we'll talk about this when we get to Romans 1. Paul is quick to point out right after he lets people know that homosexual active sex, the sexual relations, penetrative sex is not in accordance with the nature that God intended, that we all suffer from our own problem of sins. Okay, we all have more than enough repenting to do, and so if we're going to be calling someone out, we ought to also take a good look in the mirror, because none of us, we don't have the right to judge. And I'm an attorney, and I know judges. They get paid to judge, and until somebody pays me to judge, I'm not doing it. Just not worth it. I don't. Sure. I want to extend the recognition that all of these people are brothers and sisters. They're all children of God. And in my view, my job is to love them, not to judge them, but it's also to accurately reflect what I consider to be a divinely inspired message. That's different from the way Dan treats the text, by the way. He doesn't consider it to be authoritative or inspired at all. In fact, he considers it to be contrary to being inspired. He considers it to be harmful. So yeah. We have a very different regard for the text and what it is and what it means.
Well, and I think I'm on the exact same page as you with all of that. I have, gay relatives and of all different stripes, and frankly, I love all of them, and I hope that they know that I only have their best interest in at heart. However, when we do have to come down to the question of is what is the biblical stance on homosexuality, if we ask the question, what has been revealed according to the doctrines of the church and in Scripture when it comes to these matters, that's a matter of truth, and it's either true or it's false. And how, if it's hard if it's a hard doctrine for people to swallow, that doesn't change the fact that it is what it is. It has been revealed that way.
Yeah, I want to push back to this extent. There is no the biblical. Anytime somebody talks to me about the biblical God or the biblical Jesus, I know they don't know what they're talking about. And that's because the Bible was a group of works that were brought together in the 4th century. The Bible didn't exist before then. And so when people are telling me, oh, you're out of conformance with the Bible, and I'm saying, well, as it existed at what time? Obviously, there was a collection of what was considered to be the law and prophets and Scripture. It was translated in the Septuagint in about the 3rd century BCE. That's a Greek translation of the Hebrew. The Masoretic text, of course. And so the notion of the Bible as we have it is not stable. But what's more important to understand, I think, is that I agree with Dan on this. The Bible is not univocal, okay? There is no single biblical view. There are biblical views. We can talk about the various texts, and even within the same text, we might find different views. We might find within 2 chapters a chapter that says, yes, we ought to have a king, and the next chapter, no, having a king is usurping God's place, which actually appears, by the way. Or we might have a chapter that is telling us that divorce is always unacceptable, and another one that says, well, it's unacceptable except for adultery, and another that says, yeah, you shouldn't get divorced unless you got good cause. So,
but would you say, and could I push back maybe a little on that? Because, and while I agree with you, there's all sorts of contradictions in the Bible, and the Bible is not univocal in a hard univocal sense. But I think it would be unfair to push that too far and say that there is not a certain consistent themes that seem to emerge more than other themes within the Scriptures. Like a certain text or idea in the Bible might be much more of an anomaly within the text and within the theme that's going on rather than others. Because to say that it's completely, that there's no one voice, there's no, that's to say in essence that there's no message at all in the Bible that can be seen as a general message that's carried throughout. Like, I mean, could we say that God's love for his children is at least a theme that we can see running throughout the Bible?
What we can see is the view that God is personal, that he can be, he responds to prayer, he's available, he reveals himself, he's a he, and God is a very personal being. Now, that's not true of all religions, obviously. For Buddhism, there is no personal being, for instance. The religions of the book, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, have a personal deity. They're called theists, okay?
Yeah.
As opposed to pantheists and so forth. But we have, for instance, the older strata of the Bible, we have a very clear view of what I would call the city-state view of gods, if you will. So each city-state had its own deity, and became identified as the deity of Israel, both, and which were divided into northern and southern kingdoms. The view of who Yahweh was differed somewhat even between the northern and southern kingdoms. It certainly differed from writer to writer, and certainly over time. But the relationship that Yahweh has to the Canaanite deity El, or El Elyon, El means God, and El Elyon means the Most High, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so we have this kind of a view. Now, there's another theme I'd like to point out, and there's this kind of what I would call, because I'm I'm a modern person. I like to look at the Bible in a way that makes sense of what it's telling me. Um, and, I'm recognizing that I'm appropriating it. But I think the general biblical text provides trajectories to us. Let me give you an example with respect to slavery and blood feud. With respect to slavery, the length and duration of slavery was limited in Israel. It was more like an indentured servant. A person who couldn't pay a debt would become a slave. And there were rules about how to treat slaves and even giving a certain recognition to slaves. And then in the New Testament, you get a recognition that everyone is equal before God. Doesn't matter if they're a slave or not. Before God, they're equal. That's revolutionary, by the way. Okay.
Yeah, totally revolutionary.
And what I see is this.
Oh, go ahead.
There's this trajectory that eventually led to the kinds of abolitionist movements that we saw throughout the world, and specifically in the United States. Obviously, some people, never accepted slavery after about the 17th century, but slavery's been the rule rather than the exception.
Yeah.
And slavery was widely practiced even among tribes in Africa, where they would take slaves. And so the bottom line is there's this trajectory of recognizing the additional status of slaves over time. And I think it led to the kind of sensitivity that we have where we just reject slavery altogether now. And so I see these kinds of trajectories. Another is blood feud. I mean, the standard practice, and I've actually written a paper on this. You can find it on my website, blakeostler.com. Blood feud. I mean, you would respond to an infringement upon your tribe or your city-state with completely wiping out your enemy. And the biblical codes put a limit on blood feud. There were limits to what could be done in terms of killing your enemy, in terms of taking on your enemy. That evolved in the New Testament to a desire for peace, universal peace. And we see also the development of a just war concept, for instance, beginning in the 4th century, primarily with Augustine. It's one of the good things he did, in my view. And then we see that developing into a code of laws after World War II, if you will, the Geneva Conventions. Nobody follows them, but at least they're there. And so what I'd like to say is, I think we see in the Bible these kind of trajectories that develop over time of a recognition, and that the Bible remains very valuable for us in its trajectories to see those kind of things. So that obviously is a theological overlay on the text. It's not what the text delivers to us.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the way I look at the biblical text and the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition generally is there's an atheist historian named Tom Holland that I'm a big fan of. He wrote a book called Dominion, where he basically came to realize that all of our modern ethics that we all have and take for granted all ultimately came out of a Judeo-Christian ethic. But the thing is that there's a human default. The default state of human beings is tribal, enslaving, domination ethic. Like that's male dominated.
You're saying that the heart of darkness is the natural state, and essentially that gets it right. I'm not sure that's true. There's actually an instance where a group of young men got stranded on an island. It wasn't the heart of darkness, it was real. And they organized and essentially made laws. But maybe they had a modern concept already. So
well, regardless, the idea, I think that human beings by their nature are both a combination of good and evil, right? But if we look historically at any thriving empire in the past, they weren't based on, love one another, universal human rights, any of that kind of stuff. They were based on essentially the conquest ethic. And the way I look at Christianity is that and even Judaism to another extent, is that there was a sense, especially Christianity, that they undermined it. And so it doesn't surprise me that I find within an ancient culture in a biblical text bleed over from the culture of that time,
of course,
that talks about slavery. What actually is surprising is that there's stuff in there that actually fights against it.
No, I agree with you. I agree. Take another one. I mean, we're going to see this in Romans 1, where Paul says something revolutionary, and that's that a woman has rights over against her husband with respect to access to his body and to be treated kindly with honor and sex. That's revolutionary.
Yeah.
And, to include a woman in that kind of a recognition was so countercultural. Okay.
Yes.
He doesn't get the credit he deserves for that kind of a thing, in my view. And so,
because what people do is they look and they see the barbarian culture of their day bleeding at times into the biblical narrative, and they're like, look, it's bad. And it's like, no, you guys are missing it. That's the normal part. We expect that. What we don't expect is, like, look at the gems that are in there and how they've transformed the world.
But let me say, I don't buy into the progressive myth that things are just getting better and better and better. There were more people killed.
And nor do I.
Yeah. More people killed in wars during the 20th century than any time in human history. It's
by
probably
atheist regimes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a pretty good argument that the Third Reich wasn't an atheist regime, but in any
Certainly
event,
not a Christian regime.
Well, that we had a power-hungry madman at the top is no secret. We might say that Vladimir Putin is the same kind of thing these days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I just don't believe that it's, the onward and forward, Citius Altius Fortius is not the way history goes.
Yeah, definitely not. So going back to Dan. So Dan he has a TikTok channel that's blown up, and essentially what he does in these TikTok channels is that he has people who are not biblical scholars, but that are online, talking about the Bible, kind of spouting off. And then he comes in as sort of I'm the expert. Let me rip it all apart for people. And it's kind of this mismatch between some dude who listened to something from his pastor against someone who's actually trained in biblical scholarship. And so Dan comes off looking rather tough because, when you're a professional boxer and you're going around the amateur, junior leagues punching people in the face, you kind of look like a big tough guy. And so...
Yeah, one of the things that I do have an issue with Dan is he's constantly calling out these non-scholarly, people who are just basically giving their views without, the kind of educational background that Dan has. And he's always pointing out, and one he points out, there's an individual who starts out by pointing out the dictionary definition of bigotry and prejudice. And Dan comes on, what I think about the dictionary fallacy and the etymological fallacy. and there are such fallacies, and in fact, he is committing such fallacies. Then Dan goes on to use the definition as a basis for his own critique. And so, but Dan is committing the straw man fallacy big time here. The straw man fallacy is the fallacy is where you take a weaker argument and disembowel it, but you haven't accomplished anything because there's a stronger way of presenting or a stronger argument out there. And so you really haven't touched it, but you give the impression that you've dealt with the argument and that you're the expert, you know what it is, and these people are nincompoops, have no clue what they're talking about. And so it's kind of taking advantage of a power structure where he has a PhD and they don't. Mm-hmm. And so he's taking advantage of, I'm smart and they're stupid, and I've got the credentials to prove it.
Yeah. Which maybe is a bit of an authority fallacy unless he provides a good coherent argument where people are expecting people to take his word for it because he has the PhD. Where frankly, I grant some authority to PhD, but I expect a PhD to give a really good argument. Sometimes Dan does, not always.
Yeah, sometimes he does, but what I'm saying is there is a certain there's a certain cachet that is purchased simply with the notion that I'm an expert and they're not. Mm-hmm. And he's not taking on experts, if he really wants to take on experts, then he wouldn't be taking on the people that he's taking on. He would be taking on people like Robert Gagnon or Gagnon, depending on how you want to pronounce it, because I speak the other languages, Gagnon is French, that's kind of how I want to say it. Or he'd be taking on Richard Davidson, a number of other scholars. He wouldn't be taking these people on at all. And he ought to be taking on Boswell. He ought to be taking on Gagnon. He ought to be taking on people who speak his language. And so, he's scoring cheap points in my view.
Well, I want to welcome Dan onto this show anytime. I think it'd be great for you two to have a discussion on my show. I would love to even have a discussion with him. I'm not an expert, but I think I know enough that I could hopefully be able to intelligently address some of the things that he's saying. And so Dan, this is an open invitation. If you're watching this, you're welcome to come on and have a discussion.
And I extend the invitation. We ought to be best of friends as a practical matter. A lot of what he talks about and is addressed, he could be pulling right out of my third or second volume, where I've made essentially the very same arguments before he did on creation ex nihilo, or the council of gods, or on, for instance, the meaning of the phrase, after all we're saved by grace after all we can do. I gave essentially the very same argument he does, where I argue that can't mean that we have to do everything we can do before we get saved, because nobody's ever done everything they could do. And therefore nobody would ever be saved if that were the interpretation.
Well, Blake, if you just started putting all this stuff on TikTok, you'd have all the followers.
Yeah, but I'm not monetizing my scholarship, and I'm not creating a priestcraft. So
good point. Well, hey, let's actually dig in. Let's get into his video here. You'd kind of referenced it. So in this video, he is addressing a young man who is talking about. First of all, he's talking about bigotry. Then he was talking. This young man was saying that sin is missing the mark. And then let's go.
Right about that. That is what sin means.
Yeah. So let's just go through this. We'll watch it, and then you just tell me when to pause it, and then we'll kind of use this as the basis of our conversation here. I actually want to go back here to Levirate. Let me find the spot. Okay, this is the dictionary argument. Okay, here we go.
Sin is going to be.
Sin is defined as an immoral act considered to be a transgression against divine law, but it was translated into English from the Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark, like in archery. And that's a good way of conceptualizing sin, to miss the mark. And the mark would be the most ideal ways of bringing about goodness and progress within yourself and for humanity. So to commit a sin in the most fundamental sense is to do anything that doesn't strive for goodness and progress.
So this creator's argument is still mired in the dictionary fallacy, but we are adding to it the etymological fallacy, as well as an entirely arbitrary assertion about what the mark is that sin misses. So this is just this creator's own personal rationalization of why homosexual behavior should be considered a sin.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, he's right. Hamartia is the word that is used for sin. It does mean missing the mark. He's accurate about that. And in its most fundamental sense, that's a good way to start to understand the conceptualization. You can't leave it there. You've got to go to whatever context, culturally, textually, and so forth, the word is used in to fully understand it. But you've got to begin with kind of a beginner's understanding of what Greek means to be able to then do the further study. And so he's not just being picky here. He's essentially trying to demonstrate, I'm much smarter. I can tell you all about these fallacies. But he's also going to go on and use the dictionary fallacy himself as a basis for criticizing the essentially what was said. He earlier did it with the notion of what bigotry is. And then he used the very term to criticize this person's point of view and what it is. So the bottom line is that it's a hypercritical approach to establish one's dominance in terms of scholarly acumen.
Well, and one thing I noticed is that he says that to miss the mark, this is just an arbitrary mark that you're setting up for someone to hit. Now, the conceptualization of sin in our theology is exactly that. It's missing a mark, and that mark is defined by the plan of salvation. And if you are doing things that take you off the path of the mark is exaltation, right? Like that's what we're shooting for. Sin is that which leads us away from that end. And so for him to say that the point is arbitrary, Now, granted, he's addressing this young man, obviously, but from a Latter-day Saint conception, I would say this guy's right on. Like, yes, it's good to say that sin is that which misses a particular mark that we're trying to hit.
Yeah, I'd say this is rhetoric attempting to establish one's superiority. And that's all.
Let's see where he goes from here.
The reason sex before marriage is considered a sin is because there isn't the premeditation of producing offspring, or at least there shouldn't be outside of the institution of marriage. And the reason that matters is because producing offspring would be something that's good and progressive for humanity. Engaging in homosexual acts is a sin partly because it is impossible to produce offspring in such a way.
So the argument that same-sex intercourse is at least in part sinful because it cannot result in the production of offspring is absolutely something that we find in a handful of Greco-Roman period Jewish texts that are not in the Bible. And it's certainly in the background of some of the legislation regarding sex in the Hebrew Bible. But we find a complication in the New Testament. And that complication is that several authors do not care at all about procreation. In fact, Paul and the author of Matthew and the author of Luke directly advocate for celibacy as a higher ideal, as a more righteous way of living. Now they recognize that not.
Yeah, let's comment about that. This is an argument that Dan makes over and over again. He's telling us that Paul's view on homosexuality is irrelevant because we don't really trust Paul at all on what he says about marriage and sexuality. We've negotiated away in his terms any notion of celibacy that Paul taught. And so if Paul was wrong about celibacy, he's also wrong about homosexuality. Now, that's a logical fallacy in and of itself, okay? It's a false dichotomy. It's also a hasty generalization if it's meant to be an inductive kind of an argument. And so he's now engaging in another logical fallacy. And to boot, it's just factually wrong. What he does is what he's saying. Notice who he called out. Paul, the author of Luke, who he takes not to be Luke, and the author of Matthew, who he takes not to be Matthew. I would agree with him that there's real question as to who authored those texts. The texts don't say who authored them, okay? And the attributions come much later. But whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts, and it seems that Luke is a very good candidate for that. That's all beside the point. I want to talk a little bit. Let's go to Luke and what he's talking about there, because this is really important. If we go to Luke, where he's talking about levirate marriage, he's talking about a question that was put to Jesus. And what I'm going to tell you is that Dan's argument on this literally has no application whatsoever to saying that we should be celibate in this life at all. It's just not accurate at all. So here's beginning in verse 27. So
and Luke, what chapter of Luke is this?
It's Luke 20, and I'm reading from the NIV. Okay,
Luke 20, verses 27?
27, yeah.
NIV. Okay, I can pull this up and put it on the screen so the audience can see it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah, let me pull that up real quick. Okay, so we should. What was that?
I love that you can edit this stuff.
Yeah. All right, so we're looking at Luke 20, starting in verse 27.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so I'm going to be just looking at this and commenting on it as we go, okay?
Okay.
Now, there was an argument. The Sadducees used this argument to prove that there was no resurrection. Some of the Sadducees who say there is no resurrection came to Jesus with a question. Teacher, they said, or rabbi, probably. Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first one married a woman and died childless. The second and then the third married her, and in the same way the 7 died, leaving no children. Finally, the woman died too. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her? Now, we're talking about levirate marriage, okay? And I want to point out that throughout this text, the kind of marriage that Jesus is responding to isn't general marriage. It's specifically marriage is considered in this particular question about levirate marriage. Now, this comes from from Deuteronomy.
Levirate marriage is where if your brother dies, then basically the other brother takes his brother's wife to basically ensure she's not a destitute widow.
Yeah, I'm going to read from Deuteronomy 25, which is what lays out the Levirate marriage. I'll begin in verse 5, and if you want to pull that up, we can do that too. I'm going to go through.
You go ahead and just read it, and then we'll come back to this.
If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. First thing to notice is, doesn't matter whether the brother is married already or not. This is his duty. And so anyone who claims that at least this part of the Bible doesn't sanction polygamy doesn't know what they're talking about. Okay. 7, however, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, he shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry on his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of his town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, spit in his face, and say, this is what is done to the man who shall not build up his brother's family line. That man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Now, what we're talking about here is what the Jews call Yibum, which is the ceremony where you go essentially if you're going to accept a brother's wife. But there's another ceremony, which is if the brother won't accept it, called Halisa, where she and the brother would both renounce that relationship. So it's a voluntary relationship, and either one of them or both together can renounce it. Okay, that's what's being taught about in Luke. Now, let me make a few observations. This is what Dan is relying on for his argument that Luke prefers to have some kind of a celibate relationship, because he here is teaching, and here's what Jesus replied. He's taking this to say Jesus doesn't argue that they should be married. Jesus replied, the people of this age marry and are given in marriage. He's talking about levirate marriage. But those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come, the resurrection from the dead, will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they can no longer die, for they are like the angels. They are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. But in the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise, for he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. So what Jesus is saying is this kind of levirate marriage doesn't really matter, because it only happens after death. And after death, the brother's not going to die. He's alive. So you won't need to worry about levirate marriage after life. And that's what he's saying.
This is all given in the context of the resurrection of the dead. And so it doesn't have to do with celibacy.
Exactly. It has nothing to do with anything in this life. So what we're talking about here is that the argument that, that this somehow is showing that the writer of Luke doesn't accept is promoting celibacy, because he's teaching that there's no marriage and you don't need to worry about marriage. What he's counting on here is, they really don't care about marriage any longer. Well, they don't care about any marriage that would have to take place because of death after the resurrection. Okay.
Yeah.
But that has nothing to do at all with celibacy.
So Luke isn't a good candidate for someone who taught celibacy as the higher ideal.
Exactly. That's exactly what's happening. And then we have Matthew 19. I believe this is what he's talking about. He's talked about it several times. This is the basis for his saying that the writer of Matthew is promoting celibacy. And so begin in verse 3 of Luke 19. You're there? You want to pull it up?
I got it.
Again, I'm going to read from the NIV again, okay?
Okay.
Some Pharisees came to him to test. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Okay. So there's a split here, and the Pharisees know it, so they want to trap him. For haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Does this sound like celibacy to you so far? So he's starting with the general rule. The general rule is that everybody should be married. Okay, this is how God intended nature to be. It's what God has commanded.
Which just as a quick side note, it's interesting that Jesus affirms that God created us male and female, starting with two genders, specifically for the reason that they could be joined together and
As
become one flesh.
Now, there are several scholarly studies. When it says joined together in one flesh, it doesn't mean merely sexually. It means emotionally, economically, spiritually. This is a complete union of the two. It's much more than just the sexual union, but it also includes...
And I want to ask your opinion on this, because as I look at this verse, I use this verse a lot of the times to go right to the Savior, talking about the essential nature of the union of the masculine and the feminine. And I mean that in the most profound of senses, not just sexually. I mean it, like you're saying, as it's like a yin and yang. These are two pieces that are meant to be together, and that from that togetherness, like that's the reason that you have the two genders at all. According to this, it would seem.
According to William Loader, who has written 8 volumes on sexuality in the ancient world, he's kind of the Kinsey of ancient sexuality, okay? It was impossible for the Hebrews to really conceive of anything that wasn't male-female. But we're going to see here that, in fact, in the Gospel of Matthew, there is some sense that there's something more than just male-female. We'll get to it right now, okay?
Okay.
And this is the basis of Dan's assertion. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. In other words, divorce is not something that God intends. I tell you that everyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Now, this exception for adultery is not there in the Gospel of Mark, that this is somewhat reliant on, okay? So the writer of Matthew is adding in an additional exception here. But he's saying divorce is permitted under certain circumstances. The disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. I don't see how that follows at all. I've never understood how this text follows from that observation, but that's where they go. Jesus replied, and here's the key. Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Now, I want to point out 3 things. The word eunuch essentially means one who is castrated, but we can't always take it literally. It also can be translated as chamberlain or somebody who is given a trusting position to be with a man's wives and children. And the reason the person can be trusted is they have no sexual desire. They've been castrated. And the first refers, now obviously if people are born, they're not born castrated, okay? This is very likely referring to ambiguous sexual definition, where it's to someone who is male but doesn't have fully formed genitalia. Mm-hmm. And so they have this, this concept in mind of those who are born that way. And what he's saying is those who are born this way, notice what he's saying. It's better that they should not marry. There's a third. There are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Now, there's a word here, and this is the important concept. Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. Charisma is the word in Greek that is here. And a charisma is essentially a gift given. It's one of the gifts that Paul would recognize, a gift of the Spirit. But it's also a calling. And what he's saying is those who have essentially those who are able to live like this for the sake of the kingdom, those who are called essentially to preach like Paul, they should accept this. But it was never intended to be a permanent type of a situation, the gift that's given. So, for instance, we know that there was Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 feels slighted because Cephas gets to take his believing wife with him when he goes to preach. Paul wants to know if they get to take their wives too. So what we're looking at is not everybody who was a missionary or one who was called to be an apostolos, a sent one, was celibate. But this is a particular type of and a number of commentators agree that this is a temporary kind of a situation for one who is called to build up the kingdom of heaven. And they base that on the fact that Paul was called in this way. And we can see that. We'll pass now to Paul.
We have a parallel to that in the modern church. If you're married and you're 20 years old, you no longer will go and serve a mission. You want it. People that are called on missions are called out when they're single. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that there's a perfect parallel here, but I've always read these verses to say the way that I've seen them is, look, what he's saying is that there are those in this world who are born a certain way to where the male-female marriage may not work out, but it says, it's basically saying here, but some people are actually going to have to live this way for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. They're going to have to live a chaste life, and it may be your lot in life or in a particular calling, but I've always looked at this as a reinforcement of our law of chastity. Not that that it was the highest way to live, but rather that there are circumstances under which people will have to live celibate lives. Like Jesus can conceptualize of people having to live celibate lives.
Sexual relations outside of marriage were considered to be what in Greek is called porneia. It's a wide-ranging kind of a sense of what is not allowed. It includes fornication. It includes, it can include adultery, those kinds of things. And it is saying that if they're born that way, their calling is to be celibate. Okay. If you're not made to be married, then be celibate. And so, but it's not calling on everyone. And it's very clear that it's not calling on everyone. It's calling on those who have a special gift. And it's very explicit about that fact. And so Dan's claim that the writer of Matthew wants everyone to be celibate is just manifestly false. It's not the case. He recognizes a very small group, and he breaks it down into those three groups. I think it's very instructive. Just as you say, if you're born that way, the call is to be celibate. Now, I want to pass now to his next target, which is 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul's talking about principles of marriage and how people should be. I'm going to kind of summarize this. People should read all of 1 Corinthians 7.
Okay.
This is basically rising because of a debate that existed between the Cyrenics and the Stoics. Stoics believed in marriage. There were other Greeks who believed that marriage was not good because it detracted from a person's ability to focus on studies and things like that. Okay, so and apparently some of the saints at Corinth had adopted that view. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And Paul says, but that's not going to work because of sexual temptation. And here's where he says this. This is very important, okay? Each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Because of temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. That's the general rule. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Now, this is revolutionary that a woman would have conjugal rights. Mm-hmm. And likewise, the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, and this is revolutionary, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. I'm going to pause just for a second because people need to stop and know that is an unbelievable thing to say within the context of the Roman world where women were totally subordinate to men. And to say that a man
has any sort of subjugation to his wife of any kind like that, this is wild stuff. Like,
oh no, it's radical. I mean, it's off the charts radical. Okay.
yeah.
And so I think we should stop. It's something that's very important to recognize, that Paul is seeing this kind of mutuality in sexual relations between a husband and a wife, and the general rule, each should have a husband and a wife. Okay. Now he's going to continue. Now is a concession, not a command. I say this: I wish that all were as myself, but each has his own gift from one of one kind and one of another. I want to break this down. What he's saying is, I'm going to kind of summarize what I've said before, and I'm going to kind of give you this exception. I wish that all were as myself. It's presumably that's celibate. But whatever your own gift is, notice the word gift here is the same as the word that was appearing in Matthew. And only those who have this gift are to remain celibate. Now, what is the gift? The gift is to preach like Paul does. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it's good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, Dan is constantly making a big deal. In fact, he caricatures what Paul is saying here by asserting that Paul sees sex as lustful, that should be passionless. You know, you go and you lay on top of each other and hopefully something happens, apparently. But that's not what's being said at all. What Paul is actually saying is that passion should be kept within the bounds set by God. In modern parlance, a wife should not be objectified as a sex object, and neither should a husband. And it's important that they maintain an honorable relationship with one another. Now, who wants to disagree with that? Now, if you caricature it the way that Dan does, in the ancient world, they were really concerned about this kind of run amok passion. You know, we shouldn't have a passion marriage, is what they're saying.
Would you mind if we actually play that clip? I would like to, because that's the next part that he goes into. I think it would be good to actually let Dan kind of flesh it out, and then we can respond to it a little bit here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that up, and we'll let Dan kind of talk about his take on Paul's sexual ethic here.
That not everybody can hack it, but they would like everybody to be able to live that higher law. And
he's talking about the higher law of celibacy. I'm actually going to come back here just a little bit.
Way of living. Now, they recognize that not everybody can hack it, but they would like everybody to be able to live that higher law. And those who can't hack it, Paul says it's better to marry than to burn. And that means to burn with sexual desire, because sexual desire was considered corrosive and problematic, which is why he said, even if you did get married, you should possess your vessel. And that means men, you should possess your sexual receptacle, your wife, in holiness, in honor, and not with the passion of desire, like those dirty, dirty Gentiles who don't know God. In other words, even if you do marry to escape the burning of sexual desire, your sex should be prophylactic, in that it should only occur to the degree that it suppresses your sexual desire. So the argument.
So there, I think the thing that really got me as I watched that was his notion that not only that sex is supposed to be, passionless, but that he kind of painted it as though Paul was making it out that man is supposed to possess his woman, his, sexual receptacle. When it's like you just pointed out in the verses, it's very clear that Paul actually is talking about something quite different, which was a sort of a sexual equality and reciprocity that certainly would have been radical for those days. So he does seem to be missing the point there. Any other thoughts?
Well, it's not only that, he's saying sex should only happen to the extent necessary to satisfy sexual desires, right? That's not what he's saying at all. Paul actually expressly states that those who are older, who can't have children, engage in sex. He recognizes the sheer reality that, in fact, we're sexual beings and we have desires. And if we don't satisfy those desires, we're going to be subject to temptation. It's just a given human reality. Mm-hmm. So what he's really doing here is caricaturing Paul. There may have been those in the Greco-Roman world who actually, and the Jews kind of saw it this way, because remember, there were sexual prostitutes in like the temple to Molech. There were in the temple to Aphrodite, where they would have orgies and their passions were run amok. And of course, the Jewish writers didn't approve of that. The Stoic writers didn't approve of that either, and they approved of marriage. Yeah. But there's nothing in Paul suggesting that he limits sex to simply satisfying the man's need. That's just false. The text doesn't permit that reading, is what I'm saying. It's this kind of mutual reciprocity and mutual honoring that he's actually talking about. And it's revolutionary. And so he's caricaturing Paul in a way that I think doesn't do justice to Paul and those dirty, dirty Gentiles. It's really the dirty, dirty right-wing people that he wants to denigrate. But we'll move on.
We'll get into some of that and other stuff.
I want to put this into some perspective, Paul, because what Paul's really doing is he's adopting kind of an interim view. And the interim view is in light of the fact that we have an imminent parousia, or the return of Jesus. And because the time is so short, people should remain exactly as they were. So in verses 17 through 24, he's saying, whatever circumstance you were in, you should remain in that circumstance, because there's just not time to really do anything but build the kingdom of God. So everybody who can should go out and preach the gospel, because Christ is coming back and we've got to prepare the kingdom for him. Now, I want to put this into perspective in light of Jeremiah 16. The reason I want to put this into perspective is this is another crisis type of a recommendation, saying that no one should have sons or daughters because of the impending disaster. So in Jeremiah 16, God is warning Jeremiah about the fall of Jerusalem that's about to happen. 16:1. Then the word of the Lord came to me. You must not marry and have sons or daughters in this place, for this is what the Lord says about sons and daughters born in this land, and about the women who are their mothers and the men who are their fathers. They will die of deadly diseases. They will not be mourned or buried, but will be like dung lying on the ground. They will perish by the sword and famine, and their dead bodies will become food for the birds and the wild animals. So Paul's admonition regarding being married in this interim period, while we're waiting for Christ to come with the imminent parousia, is the kind of thing that Jeremiah is talking about. And it's really this interim kind of an ethic. And so it really this is what has no application to us. And he's definitely not saying everybody should be married. He's saying, no, you don't do anything wrong if you marry. And notice he says, but because of the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each her own husband. And he's recognizing in the backdrop of the command that people should marry, he's saying that in this interim period, this command is suspended in a sense, okay?
Yeah. Because of the basic idea is that because of the imminent nature that he had of the second coming, he kind of saw it the way Jeremiah did and said, hey, things are going to get really bad. Let's just kind of keep things where they are. If you're going to have sexual relations within marriage, that's fine. But, because we are sexual beings, but like, let's not try and have a bunch of babies right now because things are going to get really rough.
Yeah, they're going to get really bad before they get better. But something even more, Paul is saying, I want people to be like me. He believes that the kingdom has to be prepared for Christ to return, and that's going to require a good deal of missionary work. And so he wants everybody who can to leave aside the notion of getting married or being tied down by family bonds even, to go out and preach the gospel like he does. That's what he's saying when he wishes everybody were like him, out preaching the gospel, okay? And so this is not emphatically, Paul is not saying that everyone should be celibate. And he's emphatically not saying that it is superior to being married. It's simply the rule that applies during this interim period. And so Paul is, Dan is caricaturing Paul again on this. And he's saying, well, we don't trust Paul here, but I think we ought to trust Paul here. I think we ought to respect one another. I think we ought to.
Well,
go ahead.
Let's let him kind of continue to talk about that, because he does make these arguments, and as we continue to go through the video, I want to hear him kind of say it himself, because I think I see what you're saying though. You're saying that Paul was basically saying, look, we're in a very special time right now, and I would rather us all, instead of just like going about our normal businesses, having children and raising our families, that we all get involved in preparing the kingdom, because like Jesus is coming soon and that's the priority right now. And I wish you guys were all like me. And so if you're not married, don't get married. Like, go out and preach the gospel, and don't we're going to suspend for this time the normal business of things. Is that more or less kind of?
Yeah, that's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 7.
Okay, let's see what how Dan kind of frames this.
Argument that same-sex intercourse is at least in part sinful because it cannot result in the production of offspring was a non-starter for the author of Matthew, for the author of Luke, for Paul. They could not have cared less about procreation because they thought Jesus was coming back too quickly for that to be a consideration anyway. That's why in the Gospels we have, woe to those who are found with child at the second coming. Not going to go well for you. So what does that mean? Don't get pregnant. Don't have sex. Be celibate. Live a higher law. So this argument doesn't work once we get to the New Testament. But we still have...
I hate that you kind of put in there like live a higher law, and it seems clear that seems to be an extrapolation he's making, not necessarily based on our understanding of the context of that particular time.
Yeah,
because
well,
obviously, if
I mean,
it doesn't make any sense. Like, if God wanted us to be totally celibate, like all the time, that would just lead to the end of humanity.
Everybody recognizes that, but they also recognize, he says he wants it for everyone, but it's clear he doesn't want it for everyone. He recognizes that only very few will be able to do this, and that the general rule is that people should be married. That's why I emphasize that. Again, Jesus leads off when he's talking about these kinds of issues with the male and the female. Paul leads off with the husband and the wife being devoted to each other, and that they should remain that way. He's not saying that those who are married should get unmarried and become celibate by any means or stretch of imagination. So the assertion that he's wishing that everybody would go and live a higher law is just not true. Now, for that period of time, and he recognizes the rationale here. The rationale is that we're in an interim period with the imminence of the parousia, and so we have a different rule that applies. We have to go out and do missionary work, and I don't want you distracted by families and wives. It's that simple. Mm-hmm. So how is that relevant to us now? It isn't. It's exactly the opposite of what he asserts. He's asserting that we can't trust Paul on celibacy because it's not applicable to our time. He's right. It's not, the argument isn't applicable to our time at all. That's not what Paul teaches. Elsewhere, Paul specifically teaches about the man and the woman and how they should be united. And so the notion that Paul is teaching that we should, he hopes that everybody will become celibate, that's just false on its face. That's not accurate. The notion that it's a higher law, it is a greater demand because of the urgency during that time. It's not a greater demand when that urgency doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist. And so it's not the case that what the argument that he's making holds water at present. It's just not an accurate parsing of the text. And he recognizes that. He gives the rationale, but he ignores it.
Yeah, and now he starts to shift over from, he's kind of saying, well, Paul had these crazy ethics about celibacy, but, and now we're going to, he shifts over to talk about how, obviously we ignore Paul about celibacy, so now let's ignore him when it comes to, same-sex intercourse. So
the logical fallacy that if he's wrong about one thing, he's wrong about everything. Okay.
Yeah, which is kind of bad, because if you really want to take that logic really far, it's like, well, Paul also held that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. So if he was wrong about celibacy, maybe we can just throw that out the window too. Like, at what point do we throw the whole thing out the window?
And Paul also taught that we should love one another and that we should have works of love. But if he's wrong about one thing, now maybe Dan, let's give a saving grace to Dan here. Maybe he means only with respect to sexual issues. Okay. We can't trust Paul on sexual issues. We've already negotiated away so much of Paul on sexual issues that nothing that Paul says on sexual issues has any merit. That's clearly not true based upon what we've just read. It has great merit. And the bottom line is it simply doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur to assert that if he's wrong about one thing, he's wrong about everything. So
yeah. Well, let's continue here.
Doesn't work once we get to the New Testament. But we still have Paul advocating against same-sex intercourse in Romans and in 1 Corinthians, and someone writing in Paul's name decades after his death, doing the same in 1 Timothy. So why did they consider it sinful if procreation obviously wasn't a consideration? So the best we can do with the available data is observe that Greco-Roman period Jewish and Christian authors thought that same-sex intercourse violated the socially constructed hierarchy of domination and penetration that was salient throughout the Greco-Roman world before, during, and after this period. It was considered unacceptable for a free-born male citizen to take a submissive or a subordinate role in an act of sexual intercourse, even with another woman. And I've talked about this in a number of videos. As late as around 1000 CE, we have people talking about how it was considered unacceptable for a woman to be on top and a male to be on the bottom. And we see that in some rabbinic literature. We see it in ancient Mesopotamian literature. And that social hierarchy is no longer relevant. Now, the other factor that was salient ancient.
Okay, so he's making the claim that this didn't have to do with like same-sex relationships per se, but that it was wrong for a man to take penetration or to be in the submissive role in sex, even if that meant being on the bottom when having sex with his own wife. And so because of that sort of a crazy ancient culture, that's what this really was about. Paul wasn't actually talking about homosexual behavior. He was just talking about it's wrong for you to have another man dominate you or something like that. Is that,
Yeah,
I'm trying to steel man his argument the best I can.
The argument, what the Greco-Roman, and not all in the Greco-Roman world accepted this view, but there are a number who talk about the passive male, and it's dishonorable to be the passive male. They then say, the counter argument is, they argue that it's wrong. We would recognize that it's wrong for a man to be controlling and to rape. Okay. In modern parlance, they would say, well, it's wrong to be the bottom. They'd also say it's wrong to be the top in ancient culture. But Paul gets around both of those in Romans. It's not even relevant to the text of Romans in a lot of ways. But what we have here is a misdirection. He's recognizing that there is one consideration in the ancient world. And my view is that Paul is rejecting precisely that ancient view of matters. He's rejecting that way of looking at the issue because he's rejecting the Greco-Roman way of approaching same-sex relationships. And not same-sex relationships per se, but specifically same-sex penetration. Okay. I agree with Dan that it is always a mistranslation if we translate the word homosexuality. The Bible is not interested in a status or in some kind of a fixed orientation. They didn't even have the concept of orientation that we have, and our concept of orientation is completely a cultural construct. We came up with that. It's new, and it's just the way we think about it. It's not built into reality, okay? But the bottom line is that Paul is giving us a number of hints that that's exactly what he doesn't have in mind. So the first thing that I think that Dan is reflecting, and let's recognize that there are a number of scholars who have made this kind of an argument. And according to William Loader, as I said, he would be probably the leading authority on all of these issues. And William Loader is saying that Paul is not so much concerned about a subordinate role as violence to the order of creation. And that's in Romans 1. So what I'm going to do, we're going to look at two texts. Let's take on first 1 Corinthians 6, where the real debate begins, because we get a number of scholars who begin, and what they're really doing is taking on the notion, and this begins basically with D.S. Bailey clear back in 1975, who's pointing out, because in 1945 there was a change in the translation. They changed the word to homosexuality or homosexual. Mm-hmm. And he's pointing out Paul is not really talking about this kind of a status as a homosexual. In other words,
he's talking about a specific behavior.
Exactly. They're talking about behavior. not status.
Because they didn't, I mean, they didn't, as you already pointed out, they didn't think in terms of sexual orientations. That's a modern conception. They just thought in terms of actions that people are doing, and certain acts that people that do are wrong, not sexual orientation markers like we have today.
I'm going to qualify that a bit, because it's extremely clear that there are ancient works that have something very close to orientation in mind, okay? So just give me a second. I'm going to find this. We have, I would assert, probably a dozen ancient works that recognize that there is what they call a habit. They don't talk in terms of orientation. For them, it's a habit. This is something that is done repeatedly and perpetually. So you get an argument by Boswell, who is arguing that there is virtually no concept of a stable sexual identity in the ancient world. But that's not quite true. Everybody agrees that Plato in the Symposium and in Phaedrus write and recognize that there is this kind of stable desire between men, okay? He breaks down things into a trichotomy, if you will. You've got men who were divided from women, and you've got women divided from women and men divided from men, and they seek their union. And that is it's obviously a myth, but there's a recognition, and that there is this kind of a recognition of a stable orientation, and they wouldn't call it an orientation, they call it a habit. Philo, as a matter of fact, Philo of Alexandria writes of those who habituate themselves to the practice of homosexual acts. That's in Special Laws 3:37 through 42. He also addresses this in De Vita Contemplativa in 59 through 63. Josephus says that homosexuality had become a fixed habit for some, and against Appian. Cicero and Juvenal, Ovid, and so forth all talked, and they're speaking from the Greco-Roman side. They recognize this kind of a fixed desire for someone of the same sex. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that there's no conception. Mm-hmm. It's not like there weren't people that they recognized had a proclivity to prefer people of the same sex, okay? It's not like homosexuality simply didn't exist in the ancient world, so they just didn't notice. Mm-hmm. That's not the case. But what is the case is that as far as Paul is concerned, what's at issue is not this proclivity. It's not this desire at all. It's the acting out in behavior that's at issue. And that's why it's not homosexuality that's at issue. And that's the way Paul recognizes it. So what we have in 1 Corinthians 6, this is again from the NIV, and I'm going, this is 6 and 9, if you want to pull that up.
Got it.
Okay. Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor greedy, nor drunkards. And it goes on. Practice of homosexuality is recognizing that it's not just a term that is a fixed orientation. They're practicing. In the footnote C, the two Greek terms translated by this phrase refer to passive and active partners in homosexuality.
Do you know what the Greek term is that's used here in 1 Corinthians? Is it arsenokoitai?
It's arsenokoitai is the term for an active, and I don't think it really means an active participant. I think what it means is a man who beds another man. Okay.
Yeah, because
I think they're reading into the term something that isn't there in the text. That is the cultural background from the Greco-Roman world, but that's not what Paul is referring to. Paul is in fact referring to the prohibitions on homosexuality in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20.
And just to go to this word, right? Because it doesn't say homosexual. They have it translated. I've seen it in various translation. Men who have sex with men who practice homosexuality. But there is a focus on the act, and it specifically. But the word, if we go back to the actual Greek that's used, is arsenokoitai, which is basically two words put together. It's not an actual just like word that they had out there. It was as if Paul created this word as
right. This is
a man better.
Yeah, but it very clearly refers to homosexual penetrative sexual activity. Okay, it's the behavior that's in question, and it's not referring to a status. And so the argument that all he has in mind here is this hierarchy of dominance. Paul's actually using both terms to show that he's not talking just about a passive partner. He's also talking about men who have the action of going to bed with other men, essentially. But he's also, if you've got it, we can bring up the quotes in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20.
Yeah, because there's that word that he makes up, arsenokoitai, which is basically to bed a man,
right?
And that's
notice that our word coitus comes from the quote in here, the kotai.
Oh, so when we say coitus, that's from the same.
Yeah, it's from this Greek word.
And so it's basically man coitus.
Right. Well, coitus means bad. Okay.
Yeah. But we all know, like if I say I'm taking my wife to bed, people generally have an idea of what that means.
It was very clear even in his day. This is euphemism referring to having sexual relations. Okay.
I see. So he's using that sort of language.
It's very clear that's what he has in mind because it's a male. It's a male, like with a female. Okay.
Yeah, and like you're saying, so if someone was to look at this word arsenokoitai and be like, oh well, where does this come from? Where did Paul come up with this word? Because if I'm not mistaken, it isn't a common word that's used out there. He basically was drawing, if I'm not mistaken, from Leviticus. He literally was using the words from Leviticus to create this new word.
I think there's a near consensus, and by that I mean most scholars, not just the people that I like to read, that Paul actually has in mind Leviticus in this particular passage. And now let me point out a few things. The passage just before Leviticus 18 and 22 talks about idolatry. And there are scholars who want to say, well, he doesn't have in mind homosexual sex with men in general, and he certainly doesn't with females. He's not forbidding females. What he has in mind is cult prostitution sex that they would have in their temples. So it's a form of idolatry. But if you look at the rest of the chapters, it is outlining the types of human relationships that are not permissible. And this is one of those relationships. The reason that this is the case is elsewhere in the law, it ties, in Deuteronomy in particular, it ties the sexual desires that are out of bounds to idolatry. Okay. And that's why Paul is doing the same thing here. He's not using this in the way that, I intend to limit it just to cultic prostitution. That's not what he's talking about. It's not limited that way, but it doesn't extend to females expressly in this text. Now, there's good indication that by the time of Paul, it was intended to include females. He would have understood it that way. But at least I think the way that it is written, and recognize Leviticus is written in Hebrew, not in Greek. This is from the Septuagint translation of the Masoretic text of Leviticus, okay? So what we're getting here is just the Greek translation, and Paul often quotes from this Septuagint text. This is the text that he used when he was quoting the Bible in a Greek context. And so what he's talking about here is The word that he's using in 1 Corinthians 6 is, and you can see the words are right next to each other in Leviticus 20. Arsenos and koiton are right next to each other, and it is forbidding homosexual sex. It's impossible that Paul didn't have this in mind when he's speaking in 1 Corinthians 6, okay? However, it doesn't mean homosexuality. It is forbidding homosexual sex, but let me point out another thing. He says it's an abomination. He's going to give the death penalty in Leviticus for this act. None of us believe that homosexual sex merits the death penalty. The verse that's immediately before it talks about the death penalty for having a sex with a woman during her menstrual period. Okay. Nobody is going to buy into that. So the mere fact that it occurs in Leviticus, but the early Christians adopted a hermeneutical rule that those parts of the law that Christ quoted or relied upon remained in effect. And later Christians in the first, second centuries, if they could show that Paul was relying upon it, that also was still applicable in the law. That was their kind of hermeneutic as to what they were going to see as applicable to Christians. Okay. So it's this kind of a use that Paul is relying upon in 1 Corinthians 6. So I want to agree with the critics that it doesn't mean homosexuality, and it doesn't mean homosexuals. Nobody is condemning homosexuals merely because they're homosexual. It's practicing homosexuality that's an issue. But you have to recognize that the terms that are being used here, they do mean, the second term that's being used here means effeminate. It means a person who is passive in a sense, okay? My view is that Paul is using both of these terms to show that he's going beyond and rejecting the existing Greco-Roman view that it's passive sex alone that is at issue. That's why he coins this new word, because he wants to make sure that they understand that it's not just the passive partner that is dishonored in homosexual sex.
Which is exactly kind of the opposite of what Dan is saying, where Dan is trying to say that Paul is just upholding this Greco-Roman notion that it's wrong to be the submissive one, but it doesn't say anything about actual homosexuality, or homosexual acts in general. It's just certain types of homosexual acts are wrong. But
right.
And for those who kind of go down the sort of, he was talking about prostitution or something like that, because or like I've heard people say that, he was only referring to like the Greek practice of older males having sex with young males or boys like that, but there were words for that, and this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, like pederastia.
The word malakoi can be translated as effeminate. Okay, it can be translated as passive. It can be translated as limperist in vernacular, something like that. Yeah, that's kind of stereotype of the weaker homosexual partner. But he's saying nor adulterers, nor malakoi, the effeminate, nor the arsenokoitai, and that means people who practice homosexual acts. So he's applying it, and he's being much more expansive than just the malakoi or just the relationship. He's saying that none of these are going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He's not saying, and the construction doesn't allow to say that it's the arsenokoitai who are taking advantage of the malakoi. Okay, that's not what he's saying. That's not a word allowed.
The word seems to expand the idea when in Greek there already were other words that he could have used if he wanted to use a narrow thing and say just pederastia is wrong, or just heterai, I think is how you say it, the term for the male prostitutes. So there were specific terms he could have used, but he didn't. He used this broad term that he got from the Septuagint, which says you don't have sex. Men should not have sex with each other the way that the way female and males have sex with each other.
Now let's drive this point home even more, because I now want to look at First Romans. Okay. Or Romans 1, I should say. There's no First Romans. There's just Romans.
So it's Romans 1. What verse?
Well, I'm going to kind of walk through it, but
Okay.
we're going to get serious about this, beginning in verse 21. Now, I want to put this into context. Paul's kind of introducing himself as an apostle. He's writing to people in Rome and how much he loves them and wants to see them again. But for some reason, right after introducing all of that, he wants to talk about the people who are departing from God and why they're departing from God. Beginning in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the ungodlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth of their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the worlds, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so the people are without excuse. Now, what Paul's actually talking here, and I don't think that Dan recognizes the profundity of what Paul is actually saying here. What Paul is saying is that people engage in self-deception. They actually know the truth, but they're hiding the truth from themselves. So they both know what the truth is, and they also disbelieve the truth of it. And it's what we would call self-deception. Now, there's a very large corpus of philosophical literature on self-deception and what it is. And in my second volume, I address self-deception and its relation to the human cognitive condition. But it's important to recognize that that's what he's talking about. 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. So this is the real problem. They have darkened hearts. Their hearts are no longer open to the truth. That's the real core of the problem here. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. So Paul is going back to this well-established theme that whenever one departs from God, it's a form of idolatry, okay? And what they are doing is they only look at what is sensuous for human beings to see. What Paul's really saying here is they're only relying on their senses for what they can see to be true. And this is a very profound recognition, I think, in epistemology. We recognize in modern categories that we have people who rely only on sense experience. David Hume would teach this, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, he's kind of saying that he's saying that, there are people out there who just rely on sort of the natural world and the natural man. They worship the works of their own hands. They're not in touch with God, is kind of the way I see what he's saying.
That's what he's saying. Now, Dan caricatures this, and Dan is just going to say, what he's saying is this is the reason that people are. Now, we're going to see what is the fallacy of equivocation. Dan's going to speak both about homosexuality as an orientation and about homosexuality and homosexual acts. And he aligns the two, you're going to see in this video, so that he can distract us from what's really at issue. Because he's saying, we know that's not a choice. They didn't make this choice to disregard God. And it disregards the experience of millions of homosexual Christians who, in fact, truly worship God, and they're faithful Christians. And the response to that is, we've all got our problems, and we need to recognize that we're in no position to judge. But the fact is we all have our own sinful conduct to deal with, and this is one of the conducts they have to deal with. And the self-deception and the darkened heart are the cause of the problem. Okay, that is what fundamentally is at issue. Now it says, because of this, God gave them over to shameful lust. Paul wants to caricature this. It's like, all sexual desire is bad. But shameful lusts are what go beyond. It's what what makes a sexual object a prostitute or an object to be desired only because it's an object for desire. And we can see that that's not what Paul was talking about, because he believes that there should be mutuality between a husband and a wife with respect to their sexual desire and they give themselves to each other. In other words, there should be this kind of mutual consent and recognition even among husband and wife. And what's wrong with that? Even now, notice how he is going to include women in what he's saying here. Even their women exchange natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. And we're going to come back to these words, natural and unnatural. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, what's interesting here is that Paul is avoiding the entire division between arsenokoitai and malakos. He's not addressing that at all. As a matter of fact, the term he uses for males, arsenes or arsesin, is the term that is derived from the Septuagint 1 Genesis 26. It's the term for male and female that he's adopting here. He's referring to the terminology of the division between male and female here. And he's specifically going back to the Septuagint, where we have Paul using 5 specific words that he derives from the Septuagint 1 and 26. So, for instance, he uses the word likeness, homeomati and homeoisin in Genesis 1 and 26. The word for image in Romans 1 and 23 is ikonos, and icona in Genesis 1:26 Septuagint. For human, it's anthropo, and it's also anthropo in the Septuagint. For birds, he uses the term peteonon, and he uses the very same term peteonon in Romans 1 and 26. And for reptiles, it's herpeton. It's the same term. So he's going back to the order that God has created of male and female, and he's specifically relying on the order that God created into the world as a basis for looking at what this order is. So when he's talking about nature here, he's talking about the nature that God intended, the purpose for which God established the world, his plan. We can see this again because Paul uses this word, that's Greek physis, which is our word nature, and he uses it at least 9 other times. 8 of those times clearly refer to the natural bodily functions or to the order that God has established in creation. Okay, so for instance, we can see in Romans 11, when he talks about the natural branches being grafted into the unnatural branches being grafted into the natural, what he's talking about is what God intended for the Gentiles is to become part of Israel, because that's part of the nature and intended order that God has. So, and he's using it essentially the same way.
So in this, what we have is that Paul is abandoning the categories that Dan is saying of this, dominator versus, the penetrator versus the penetrated, and it's bad for a man to be the penetrated side, which was a conception that existed in the Greco-Roman world. However, he's abandoning that entire framework and saying, look, there's an order that God has created, and those who have disconnected themselves from God now are giving themselves over to these shameful, disordered behaviors, exchanging the way God intended for these sexual, powers to be used for ones that go against not what the natural man is. I guess there's a distinction that needs to be made between, just because Dan makes this argument that now we know that homosexual behavior is natural. And yes, it's true that if it occurs in nature, sure. And in nature, animals murder each other. What we're talking about is he's talking about the nature that God intends for human beings via the endowments that he gave us of sexuality, and that they are natural within the celestial order, the celestial nature of those those endowments that we've been given. And so Paul is talking about that sort of a natural order, a celestial nature, rather than sort of just nature as in animals doing their thing.
Right. So when he's speaking about nature, if he's talking about animal nature, as you've already mentioned, he says the natural man is an enemy to God, right? So when he's speaking about that, he's recognizing that there is a way that we would be if we just gave ourselves over to our natural inclinations, our lusts. So, for instance, that's what we would tend toward. But this nature, this species, is referring to the order that is created by God, male, female. And that's the intended order that God has for the relations between men and women. And to go against that order is what is actually unnatural, as he uses the term here.
And we see that order in nature playing out, where things are designed as male and female for the purpose of the procreation of the species. And so in that sense, it's natural, and that we see it in the natural order. But I guess that the thing is it seems very clear to me that he's talking about, when he's talking about natural sexual relationships, he's talking about kind of the normal ones that you see. You know what I mean?
Well,
like the natural order of creation is for male and female to be joined to have babies.
He's contrasting the physican, the natural, with the paraphysian, which is contrary to nature. Okay. So he's not using the term unnatural. He's using the term contrary to the nature that God has established.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Contrary to the natural order established by God.
Right. And so what we're looking at is, and he's including females in this as well. In fact, he's giving females preeminence. Essentially what he's saying is it's even more unnatural for females, okay? Because they're not as given to lust as men are. I think that's the idea that he has in mind. But recognize that we're bypassing the entire structure that Dan says is the basis. Now I want to go, I've already mentioned Loder, and for whom I have a great deal of respect. And what I want to recognize is that Loder recognizes that there are a lot of basic reasons that are lying behind what Paul is saying. So what Dan is doing is saying, well, this is the reason, and it's the only reason. And what he's really doing is shortchanging the scholarship on these passages, and failing to recognize that not only is he engaging in hasty generalization, he's misrepresenting it. So what Loder would say is that first and foremost, sex violated the divine command prohibiting acts contrary to the divine order, which required mating between male and female. He does have in mind, this is also, he uses the term molokos, which shows that he has in mind the feminization of men. And then he uses the term arsenokoitai to show that he's broadening that. There's this thought that this kind of sex is not permitted because it doesn't lead to offspring. And 1 Corinthians 7 I would suggest that Paul had in mind this can't be productive, and so there would be something that it's not what God has in mind. It would be a subsidiary argument that Paul would use to suggest that it's contrary to nature. He's also saying we have to keep our passions within the bounds that are intended by God in the creation. And so passion shouldn't be allowed to run amok. We shouldn't be able to objectify and just go wild on other people, and certainly not our wives. And, we get, as I say, this caricature from Dan regarding, he doesn't want any passion in sex. That's not true. He wants passion, but within bounds that really doesn't turn the partner into simply somebody who has to sit and take it, okay? The passive partner. These people are, in fact, according to Paul, they're forbidden from entering into the kingdom of heaven. And that's another reason why these kinds of acts just because the nature of the kingdom of heaven doesn't permit this kind of unnatural, disordered kind of relationship. And so there are a number of reasons, and Loder has given all of these reasons. They're all at play in this text to some extent. And it's important to take into consideration the kind of things that Dan is talking about in terms of parsing the text. But to shortchange the reasons and to pretend like, oh, this is what he's got in mind and nothing else, that's just not accurate. So I just wanted to.
Yeah, he seems to take very small pieces of it that are partly true, and then say that's all that it means, when it can mean something much broader. Now, I want to let's real quickly finish.
That's a fallacy of hasty generalization. So,
and I think he does engage in that quite a bit. I want to let him finish up this other video. We'll watch some of it, and we'll stop and just kind of make comments as we go through it. As we're getting a little bit low on time, because I want to let Dan kind of lay out some of the stuff here that he says, and have us kind of respond to it. So let me pull him up again here on the screen.
The available data is observed that Greco-Roman period Jewish and Christian authors thought that same-sex intercourse violated the socially constructed hierarchy of domination and penetration that was salient throughout the Greco-Roman world before, during, and after this period. It was considered unacceptable for a free-born male citizen to take a submissive or a subordinate role in an act of sexual intercourse, even with another woman. And I've talked about this in a number of videos. As late as around 1000 CE, we have people talking about how it was considered unacceptable for a woman to be on top and a male to be on the bottom. And we see
stop it there.
Some rabbinic.
Yeah.
He's trying to import the entire Greco-Roman, view of the passive active partner ethic into what Paul is saying. It just isn't there. Paul's not saying women shouldn't be on top. There are texts that say that, but to read that into Paul is just another fallacy of this was in the neighborhood, and so this has to be something that he intends. It's not accurate. And
I think we showed that. I mean, it seems very obvious that he has a much broader conception of the immorality of same-sex behavior than just, I'm just talking about it's wrong for a man to be on the bottom.
Now, let me note that there are scholars who have made that kind of an argument. Boswell is one of them. Boswell was, in my view, just taken apart and destroyed because he neglected evidence, he misrepresented evidence, and the answer given by N.T. Wright is just decisive. And so, this kind of an argument has been made, but it's been responded to more than adequately. So,
I'd like for Dan to respond to N.T. Wright instead of responding to people on TikTok.
Exactly. Instead of responding to somebody who read the Bible and wanted to make sure that their view got across, he ought to take on the scholars who, he really ought to be interacting with Gagnon, and who is another leading expositor. Now, he's not going to give Gagnon any credit, and I'll tell you why. It's because Gagnon supports and defends the more or less traditional view. And Gagnon is an evangelical, and evangelical scholars just don't count in the consensus, as far as I can tell with Dan. But he's a very serious scholar and has to be taken into consideration. He ought to take on Gagnon and say, okay, I'll debate you on this. I would be very interested. Yeah. So,
me too.
And maybe it's Gagnon. I don't know how he pronounces his name. So, I don't know.
Well, he'll have to forgive us. Well, let's continue here.
Literature. We see it in ancient Mesopotamian literature. And that social hierarchy is no longer relevant. Now, the other factor that was salient anciently was the notion that same-sex intercourse violated what nature intended, went against the natural order. We know that that is not true anymore, that same-sex intercourse and same-sex attraction are things that occur naturally. They are not choices. They are inevitabilities. And
Okay,
while
stop
we cannot
this right
account
here.
entirely.
Notice how he smuggled in and enlightened two concepts here: same-sex attraction and same-sex sexual acts. He's saying they're not a choice. And, you know, he really ought to be reading literature about the fluidity of human sexuality and orientation, to the extent there is such a thing, okay? But most importantly, what he's engaging in is a misdirection. This is because, well, it may be true for some. Now, there's a broad spectrum of sexual orientation, the way we use the term, okay? And it may not be a choice for some. It definitely is a choice for others as to whether they're going to be met with a man and a woman. It's not a choice for me whether I'm going to like a man. I don't have that choice, okay? And so I can recognize there are people who don't have that choice. You can do anything you want. I'm not going to like being with a man. I'm just not built that way. And I imagine that those who are homosexual are just built in the way that women just don't turn them on. It's just the way they are. And I can accept that. But when he says that there's no choice about homosexual sex, he's acting like there's no choice about whether you take your pants off or not. And that, of course, is absurd. So when putting the two concepts together, he's just misleading us. There is a choice about whether one engages in homosexual sexual acts. There is such a choice.
This is what happens when you create a sexual identity that then becomes part of who you are, and then they conflate, as you're saying, the acts from the identity. And to say that somebody has a particular proclivity versus whether they act on it. And I think we already have addressed that in the scripture, it seems to be concerned with the notion of acts, the actual things that people do.
And what is ironic here is that Dan himself goes to great lengths to show that the Bible doesn't have, this kind of stable sexual orientation in mind, what it has in mind. Now, there's a subsidiary argument that those who are pro-homosexual often use, and that is to say these people anciently couldn't even conceive of a committed, loving homosexual relationship, okay? That's not true. I quoted these other parts to show that they had in mind people who had a stable sexual proclivity. They called it a habit or something similar. But they did have that in mind, and it was something that the culture was aware of. And but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter whether it's because of a proclivity or the one just wants to be weird for a moment. What Paul is talking about is that these kinds of acts are not in accordance with what God intended. That's the bottom line.
So there's an interesting, I'm actually going to read something from, and I'll link this below, but a friend of mine, Timber Harward, who's a faithful homosexual Latter-day Saint who's in a mixed orientation marriage and does a lot of great work on it. He was writing about that very thing of, well, they didn't, a long time ago, like people didn't know what a same-sex loving relationship was, and therefore it's sort of out of bounds. This is sort of a new thing. Anytime they were commenting on it, they were commenting on something that wasn't a monogamous, faithful homosexual relationship. And it's funny because he says in his article, he says, true, long-term monogamous homosexual relationships were never conceptualized or lived in the ancient Canaanite or Greco-Roman culture. Maybe there's some caveats to that you've pointed out. But the premise that homosexual sex is acceptable as long as it's done within a monogamous relationship is a highly flawed theory, and here's why. Homosexual sex is condemned by Jehovah along with a list of other sexual sins, including but not limited to a man having sex with his sibling or sex with someone else's child. Sex with his parent or sex with an animal. If you apply the same logic to these different condemned sexual acts, that is, yes, they are condemned, but the ancients never conceptualized or practiced loving, consensual, monogamous relationship in these instances. So his point is that, so if you have two siblings that get married and they're in a loving, consensual relationship, is that now on the table because they didn't conceptualize this anciently? Therefore, it's a new thing? Or were these sexual acts condemned and homosexual behavior was condemned along with them because they violated a particular order of sexuality that the Lord has prescribed to the world?
Yeah, and I think the logic follows. He's addressing Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 in that particular comment. We would want to caveat that we don't believe in the death penalty. And so we'll accept Leviticus only to the extent that it's expressed in Paul. Okay.
Exactly. It's we filter the nice thing about being a Christian is that we filter the Old Testament through Jesus Christ.
Right. And we read it with different eyes. We're in a different culture, and we're entitled to read it differently. We're entitled to bring to it our best understanding, and of necessity, Christians are going to have to recognize that there are things in the law that have been surpassed. That's an express doctrine of Christianity. There's no other way to read it. But we have to understand that it was a very difficult process, even for the earliest Christians, to make that determination. Most of the earliest Christians were just practicing Jews. Mm-hmm. And it took them a long time to figure out what it meant to be a Christian and a Jew. And what do we teach Gentiles, and do they have to be circumcised, and can they have table fellowship, and so forth. And so there is this kind of negotiation with the prior Old Testament text that of necessity Christians are going to have to engage in. Why Dan doesn't have to engage in it, you'll have to ask him.
Well, let's go back to Dan here for a second and let him continue.
Entirely for all of the factors involved, what we can say is that it is not something that people are able to choose. And so it is 100% a part of the natural order. So in the end, none of the arguments from the Bible or from the societies that facilitated the production of the Bible are at all relevant to today. They just don't carry water. And so people have to come up with their own rationalizations today for why they should obstinately hold to this belief. And I'm going to suggest that there are two reasons this still goes on. One is the more fundamental one. A lot of people feel an intuitive aversion to the idea of same-sex intercourse. It's just icky for a lot of people.
You can stop me here for a second. How does Dan know that? Has he done a survey? Is there some study that was done on this ick factor? How did they measure this ick factor? He's just pulling this off the top of his head without any data. He's now got his own dogma over data. Okay. So, is the way people think about the ick factor really true? I think we should see Dan here as saying, this is one of the reasons that I would have an aversion, and I've overcome it. Okay. I've overcome the ick factor. Because I don't think he can speak for anyone else. There's just not data there to support the kinds of assertions he's making.
Yeah, and it's a common argument that the only logical reason people don't, or the only reason people are against gay marriage and homosexual behavior is just because they think it's icky. And I think that's just a big time straw man. I'm going to let him finish here because then I want to talk about why it actually makes total sense as to why this doesn't fit into what the Lord is doing. Or into the plan. So I'll just let him continue.
And because we like to feel that our intuitions are good, we will frequently bring our reflective cognition to the defense of our intuitions. And so we rationalize why we feel that ickiness. And so we come up with reasons why the way we feel is good and right, and therefore why same-sex intercourse is wrong. And the other reason this opposition remains salient is because it is either meaningful or useful to people today. And as an identity marker, it is phenomenally useful for right-wing authoritarianism, for boundary maintenance, for costly signaling, and for credibility-enhancing displays. In other words, the reason that opposition to same-sex intercourse, to homosexuality in general, is still popular among many Christians is because of identity politics.
Okay. And that, so basically the only two reasons he can think of why anyone would be against homosexual behavior is because of you think it's icky, or you're a right-wing authoritarian and you're using it as a tool to structure power against people that you don't like.
Yeah, and let's recognize this is its own logical fallacy, the attribution of motive as a means of explaining why a person believes something is a particular type of the ad hominem fallacy. Okay. And so, it's like saying, well, Einstein only believed in the special theory of relativity because he had a fight with his professor and he didn't like prior physics. Okay. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Attributing the motive is irrelevant to if there's a legitimate rationale. It doesn't matter if there are a lot of illegitimate reasons. Okay. And as we've seen, there are reasons why a person who believes that Paul was inspired, or a person who thinks that Paul actually was visited by the resurrected Jesus Christ and called to spread the gospel and inspired to respond to the questions that were put to him by those that he taught. And this has been the Christian commitment since day one as a practical matter. That person may want to come to a correct understanding of what Paul is teaching to understand the order that God intended. It's the same order that Jesus taught about as we saw in Matthew. It's the order of creation. Now, those who are pro-homosexual relationship and practicing homosexuality consistent with the gospel would say that these are clobber texts. I say that the other readings they give are evasion maneuvers, okay? and he's giving us an evasion maneuver here. And you notice who the particular boogeyman is. It's right-wing authoritarianism, basically white supremacy, if you will. And there's a reason why Dan may see the world that way. He's doing the very same thing he's accusing those who are his foil. He's doing the very same thing he's accusing them of at this point. He's playing power politics, okay? And, Dan has twice been a Democratic candidate for the legislature in Utah. And I know from personal interaction with Dan that Dan is not just left-wing. He's on the far left of the far left of the left wing of the Democratic Party with respect to issues like abortion and so forth. Now, maybe he's changed his view since we discussed any of those things because he unfriended me a long time ago. And, he's entitled to do that. That's his right. But the bottom line is that when he's attributing these kinds of motives, he's really just saying you have illegitimate reasons. Now, let me go back about the ick factor. He's trying to go back and say, well, cognitive studies have shown that we have this quick response, and then we have a reflective response, okay? And sometimes they're at war with one another, but sometimes when we have this quick response, we try to come up with a reason. And that's true. Sometimes we try to justify what our initial gut feeling is. Oftentimes our initial gut feeling is correct. It doesn't make it wrong. And that we come up with a reason to justify it doesn't make it wrong either. Those are both non sequiturs to argue that if we're coming up with a reflective reason for why we feel the way we do, that it must somehow be wrong. That's not true either. That's a non sequitur. That means it doesn't follow. So what Dan is giving us here, is his explanation. Now, more often in his videos, what he's arguing is that, we're maintaining boundaries. This is really a power play to maintain power and authority and to make sure that things don't change. And if you listen to what he said, it's really because you want to continue to put down women. You want to continue to put down homosexuals. You want to maintain a certain power structure. That, too, is an ad hominem fallacy, by the way, an attribution of motive. I don't know if he even recognizes how strongly he's being influenced here by Michel Foucault, who was the original French intellectual who wrote about deconstructing texts in terms of power dynamics. But he does it constantly. And in fact, he's following Michel Foucault almost to a T, because Michel Foucault was gay. He died of AIDS in California.
Wasn't he also engaged in pedophilia?
He defended it.
Whether he was engaged in it, he justified it.
Yeah, well, I'm not. The mere fact that he had some bad ideas doesn't mean all of his ideas are bad. I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that he might be a bad man, I mean, Beethoven wrote great music even if he was a jerk. So,
Well, and I don't want to commit the genetic fallacy as we're talking about fallacies here. But I do want to point this out. Here's the thing. I can't stand that he sets up this false dichotomy of, well, it's the only reason someone could be against this is because of ick or because of politics, where it's like, no, actually, for me, it's because of reality and because of truth. Because the truth is, according to our doctrine, is that God created them male and female. And and the only way for us to hit the mark, the highest mark, as the guy at the beginning of his video was talking about, is for us to be in a male-female union. And that is just the nature of reality. As Latter-day Saints, we're actually equipped to, and it's funny because I watched recently Joe Rogan rip apart what is his name? Matt Walsh went on to talk about gay marriage. And I realized Matt Walsh, as a Catholic, is not equipped to be able to defend marriage the way that we are, because for him, this is essentially God's arbitrary sort of God. It's just an institution that God made it this way, and God doesn't want gay people to have sex with each other. Where for us, we say, no, it's part of an actual plan that God himself can't even get around. The nature of reality itself is such that the only way to attain the highest level of glory, that the law that even God has to abide, says that you have to be in a male female, the union of the masculine and feminine has to occur in order for you to reach the highest potential and participate with God in the creation of worlds without end and the great work of exaltation. And that, so we actually have, it's like, if our premises are true as Latter-day Saints, that is what exaltation requires, then it makes perfect sense that this is to miss the mark.
Yeah.
This sort of a relationship does not allow you to attain the highest level of glory. And so it's not arbitrary.
I'm going to problematize that just a little bit. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead. Push back.
It doesn't mean they're not entitled to a kingdom of glory. They're still entitled to a kingdom of glory. Second, yes, the creation story talks about male and female, but the writer of Matthew seemed to have 3 additional categories in mind that should remain celibate. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so he's recognizing maybe the world is a little more complicated than the binary male-female. And what are you going to do with John the Baptist and Jesus and Paul who weren't married?
Yeah, and obviously those are good questions to raise. With that in mind, and I think that those are challenges that Latter-day Saints have to try and address and go through. With that in mind, though, the idea of the restoration theology on that is clear, that these things are requirements for exaltation, and whether in the millennium or in some other context, there is going to be the chance for people like John the Baptist or whatever, or the unmarried, to have the chance to be married, just as they'll have a chance to receive any of the necessary components to reach their exaltation, that no one is denied that. And homosexual orientation, as what I believe to be a temporal phenomena that exists in a fallen world that will go away at the resurrection, that's something that, in my mind, it's a temporary thing. So what God has asked us to do is to be faithful to him and to his commandments. And at some point, this will go away, and everyone will have the opportunity to be united with another member of the opposite sex.
Yeah, and I think that's one very viable way to read all of that. I want to also recognize a bit of cognitive humility here. There are competent scholars who would support what Dan says. Okay? They don't have the better argument, and Dan never gets into what the best argument is. It's always just the consensus. We count noses, and that's how we determine what we believe, right? That's a fallacious way of coming up with a view. That's not how science is done. That's not how scholarship is done. And the best argument isn't done by democracy. Okay. It's just simply the fact. But we have to recognize that there are competent people who have different views. And I don't want to say that there's nothing to say besides what we've said, or that we have, given the final word. I would recommend that people read Loader, that they read Gagnon, that they read a number of competent books and studies if they want to really understand the way that scholarship has proceeded. In my view, what's happened is in our time, there has been a lot of revisionary work done to try to get away from what seemed to people to be an obvious reading. I think they've done a good job of problematizing some of the assumptions that were made. And in the end, I want to reiterate, I am in no position to judge. I've got my own problems to deal with, okay? And for those who have to deal with this issue, if they come to a different conclusion than I do, I may say, look, I think I've got the better argument because I'm that arrogant, but maybe I don't. Maybe there's room to see it the way you do, because this is a very complicated and sophisticated kind of an issue, and anyone who says otherwise is just not dealing with what's actually out there for consideration or the reality of it. And how we should respond to homosexual sex is something that needs to be considered very carefully, because I don't think that we ever want to send the message that you're not welcome. We don't want to send the message that you're lesser than. I don't think we want to send the message that my sins are better than your sins somehow. Okay. I think the message to give is come and we'll learn from each other and we'll love you. And if you love us back, then we've both gained. And we have a lot to give to each other. And if you want to live in a way that I disagree with, that's still your prerogative, because amazingly enough, God honors every single choice that we make. He's a very loving, accepting kind of guy who's not interfering with anything we've done. Okay. He isn't treating us like 4-year-olds who are running out into the road where he grabs our hand and makes sure we don't get run over. He lets us get run over. And so I want to make that the perspective. I've been pretty harsh on Dan. Again, I think if I went out to lunch with Dan, we'd probably be friends. I hope we would. I know we'd have a vigorous disagreement about politics. I think we agree on so much when it comes to biblical scholarship, really. Dan's done some good things, and he has a particular gift of explaining very complicated and sophisticated biblical scholarship to normal people who aren't eggheads like me. Okay, he's got this gift, and I'm not sure I've got that gift to the same extent. So I envy him for that. But still, if he's going to run out and set up a straw man so he can disembowel it with all of his logical fallacies, he's fair game.
For sure. All right. Well, yeah, I guess I'll just wrap up with saying the same thing. For anyone listening, what the scriptures teach when it comes to these issues is one debate to have, but how we should treat those who are our fellow sinners. And I say that in the deepest way. I don't place myself above anyone else who is also in this world trying to figure it out their best that they can. And know that, discussions like this, where we're talking about the nature of sin, we could go into any other number of sins that would be my sin, that I'm dealing with. And
yeah, I don't
just as guilty of those.
Your sins or my sins.
Yeah. But if we're talking about sin in general, and what does the scriptures teach about these things, I think that we've had a discussion that I hope people can come to their conclusions as to what the stronger arguments are here when it comes to what the Bible is actually saying on these issues and what Paul was saying specifically, so that we can be rooted in the truth and not in the truth of what the Bible is actually saying, or what Paul was trying to get across, based on what the best arguments are and not just on what we want it to say. So, all right. Anything else to say before we roll?
Thank you, Jacob.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.